So without further ado, let me introduce you to our facilitator, Jessica. She is our urban agriculture coordinator here at YRFN, at York Region Food Network. She manages all 5 of our community gardens, and she and I have worked together very closely to develop the Compost Learning Hub, like I said, which is really launching physically in, I hope, the spring. But we do have our demonstrations gardens that are just getting set up at the moment. Outside of that, Jess wears many other hats at our office place. She's definitely the resident fixer-upper here, and she is a spreadsheet master. I always go to her with all of my stuff, but I'm going to let her talk to you now about what she is most passionate and enthusiastic about, and that is gardening and taking care of the land. So Jess, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marissa. So happy to have all of you join us today for a very relevant topic in terms of cleaning up your gardens and all of that. But really quickly first, I wanted to just talk about the fact that we're connecting virtually right now, obviously still due to COVID. But I just wanted to encourage fellow settlers to just take a moment. Let's just take a moment and reflect on the history of the land that we're currently tuning in from. And I do this with the acknowledgement of the intertwining legacies of settler colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. But myself and Marissa as well, we're currently on Williams Treaty territory, traditionally cared for by the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples. And we actually have our Indigenous neighbors, the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation, as the closest Indigenous community, about an hour and 15 minutes northeast of us. But, in the same way that learning a person's name is a necessary first step in developing a relationship with them, land acknowledgements can be a very vital first step in learning who lived and continues to live on this land. But we always say first steps need to be followed by many more steps and actually many more actions. And we can, acknowledge the land and still harm it. And we can acknowledge, Indigenous people and still have no connection to them. So my question is, how can we do better? How can we go beyond just the land acknowledgement? And some questions that I try to share with people and put out there that I'm working on as well is, what does it mean to be a treaty person? What are the principles and the responsibilities that we have to the land and to each other as human beings? And just, I welcome you to brainstorm a bit on your end and even share in the comments if you have any ideas or any resources that you think would be helpful for people. And if you're outside of York Region, please feel free to share the traditional territories information that for the land that you are currently on. And so when we're talking about closing our gardens, we're talking about the land and how it, takes care of us and how we care for it. So as we get into the content of this workshop, let's just, continually investigate and bring to the forefront these questions. And I'm just going to share my screen now so that you guys can see the presentation slides. Please feel free to let me know if there are any issues with seeing the slides, and also if I'm going too quickly or not speaking loud enough, any of that stuff. This here. All right. So again, very topical, putting your garden to bed. Now is pretty much the time to be doing that. October and maybe early November. So just to give you a quick idea of what we're going to be talking about today, I'll go over, some timeline considerations, what's really pushing us and what can wait, some ecological considerations, because we are all part of the ecosystem. So how can we make sure that we're caring for it and that we're prioritizing the ecosystem as much as we are the garden and the cleanup. And then certainly there are things we can really do to do the cleanup. So, you know, like washing our tools and some of that stuff. So we'll go over that. And of course, composting is something that doesn't stop over the winter, or doesn't have to. So we'll chat a little bit about that. And also, you know, gardening also doesn't have to stop over the winter. There are things that you actually can grow into maybe December, or even start seeds now and have them pop up in the spring. So we'll talk about that. And then the last two things, we'll talk a little bit about season extension that sort of just is related to overwintering crops. And then we'll have a quick reflection on, you know, lessons learned. All right, so let's go over a few priority tasks for right now. So really they're priorities because they rely on the frost date. So basically you want to be doing these things before the ground freezes and before a frost actually hits us. So some of the things we want to think about: planting overwintering crops. You can't do that if the ground is frozen. And also sometimes these things require a little bit of time before the ground even freezes, so that it can develop some roots and really get established before it starts to, you know, go into the sort of hibernation stage. So what we're planting now, garlic for sure, and also some perennial bulbs. You know, you got your tulips, your daffodils, your hyacinths, and those who actually grow more of the flowers and landscape crops can definitely share in the comments, as well, as that's not my my expertise, but now is a good time to be planting some of those things. And also there are hardy greens. So, you know, spinach, lettuce, rapini, we'll talk a bit more about that later on, but these are things that you can actually seed right now and either keep them going with a little bit of help, you know, from some tools, or have them come up in the spring. Another thing that we can do right now is removing rooted debris, but only of specific things. I want to encourage you to, you know, make some distinctions. So diseased plants, so things that had diseases or had, you know, lots of pest pressure on it. It's a good idea to remove the plant, because that way the diseases and the pathogens aren't overwintering and coming back in the spring. Or oftentimes, you know, certain pests will actually lay eggs, and that's how they will come back in the spring. And so if you can take a note of what was, you know, what had some issues throughout the season, pull those things and just make sure they're removed from the area. Obviously, if you have things like trellising, stakes, and even row cover, that stuff can definitely freeze into the ground. So now is a good time to be taking that stuff out. Obviously, if you still have any things in the garden that you need to finish harvesting, now is a good time. We're actually quite lucky. Usually we do get a frost at this time of the year. So it's been unusually warm for us, but that doesn't mean that that's going to last. So to be on the safe side, it's always good to finish harvesting things that are frost sensitive. And again, we'll go over what those things might be. Now is also a good time to start mulching. For the purpose of insulating any crops that are in the ground that need to overwinter, like your garlic, your strawberries, some of your perennial plants. And then if you have any annual plants that need protection over the winter, so I'm talking about things that would completely die off in the winter, but you might want to bring them in, let them sort of, you know, survive throughout the winter, and then in the spring and summer, bring them back out so that you kind of have it year to year. Now is a good time to be bringing them indoors. And just a few tips for that, you know, try and do a little bit of acclimation. So put them into a pot and then maybe bring them in for an hour or two and then put them outside again, and then bring them in the next day for a few more hours. And then that way it sort of gets used to that transition. And it's not freaking out about, you know, the low humidity in the house or the difference in temperature. So just a few things to consider. We're talking about timeline and our first frost. So what does that even mean really? Like what's the definition of the frost, first frost? So we're talking about the first occurrence of 0 degrees Celsius. And if we want to get technical, this is at the standard height of 1.5 meters from the ground. So at this point, like it says, tender crops will become damaged. There will be frost damage and they won't survive. There are certainly frost hardier crops that might be a little bit better, but by -2 degrees Celsius, they'll also die off. So if you know more about the first frost date, you can really plan ahead. And here's a really handy map actually of where we are and which date is considered our first frost date. And that's generated based on data that's collected over many, many years. So it might be slightly different based on the data that's been collected or how long that data goes back. But you can see here, you know, we're kind of on the cusp. So Zone 10, Zone 11, Newmarket is over here, but Aurora might be slightly south. And then obviously we've got like Georgina and the East Gwillimbury just slightly higher up. So what that tells us is somewhere between October 1st, October 10th, or October 11th, October 20th. So you can see we're really like right in the middle of it. It could happen, and it's a good thing to plan around, even if it doesn't quite feel like it's going to be a frost date soon. And here's just some, you know, examples of things that might be very sensitive to frost. And so they would definitely die as soon as there's a frost that hits. So things like your tomatoes, your eggplants, your peppers, your cucumbers, all of these. And just to let you know, we will have these slides shared with everyone after the presentation through a follow-up email. So don't feel like you have to write all of these down. You can definitely take a look at the slides afterwards. But those are just some examples of what you want to be harvesting right now, and you know, anything that's still left out there. Something that might survive a light frost, so probably between 0 degrees and -2. You've got your broccoli, your cauliflower, kohlrabi, spinach, Swiss chard, those types of things. Obviously, the leaves might not survive, but the actual edible part that you want to eat might survive. It's a gamble, right? So obviously take that with a grain of salt. And then things that might be much more tolerant to frost. Definitely your leafy greens like kale. That stuff actually is quite hardy. Your cabbages, Brussels sprouts. So just take a look at this information and make your decisions based on you know, how tolerant these plants are to the frost. And one thing that I always tell people that is earlier is better. So if you have the time, it's always better to just go and do your cleanup. As you know, once you're done with all the plants and you know, all the harvesting, one thing to think about is that we are, you know, experiencing climate change. We're in the middle of climate change. So we might have earlier frosts, we might have later frosts, but either way, it's things are constantly changing now. So just to be on the safe side, why not do your cleanup earlier? We also have shorter days coming up, right? So I know I always think, oh, I'll do that next week. And then it gets pretty dark, it gets pretty cold. I'm starting to go into hibernation mode. and I don't want to do any of it. So earlier is better when you still got all that momentum from the growing season. So, again, will you want to do this when it's really cold? Also, will you want to do this in the spring when it's muddy? So are you going to leave some tasks for the spring? Is that really realistic? Is that really what you're going to want to do? And will it actually push your season later because you left it for the spring and you can't get started until you do certain cleanup tasks, right? So doing it now just ensures you can get a fresh start in the spring. And one thing I really want to emphasize are ecological considerations. So what are our responsibilities, obviously, to the land and to living beings and to the soil? Our priorities shouldn't just be for the garden itself, but for the actual ecosystem within the garden and even outside of it. So a good question to ask yourself is, what would the land look like naturally? So we can use nature as a guide because nature knows best, right? So what we usually see when we're not actually touching the land, that's something that we can sort of imitate because those are the most healthy conditions for the ecosystem. So one key thing, if you only take one thing away from this workshop, I would say this is it. The ground should not be bare. Okay, that's not how it naturally is. We don't have, just clear patches of soil out there. You don't find that in nature, and there's a reason for that, right? And so we definitely want to make sure that no matter what, our garden beds, our soil is covered by something. And we'll talk about that in more detail later, but just keep that in mind. And animals and birds, they actually rely on some of the seeds and plants that we have in the garden as winter food or as shelter. And so that's just something to really consider. If it's something that we absolutely need to get rid of, it had diseases, or it's a very invasive weed that we don't want to have next year, sure, we can pull that. But if it's something like, if you've got sunflowers, birds love to eat sunflower seeds over the winter. So consider not pulling your sunflowers right now, even though it doesn't look the greatest, just let them be and know that you're helping some of the animals out there over winter. And having roots in the ground is always important as well. So roots will help to promote soil structure, helps to keep the microbial life active and supported. And so as much as possible, if we can keep roots in the ground, that would be great, right? So some examples of the mulch that I'm talking about, like how to keep the ground covered. This year, actually, for the first time, we did a cover crop at one of our community gardens. And what a cover crop is essentially is a way to seed an interim crop, and we terminate that crop. So essentially, we either kill it or we crimp it, we roll it down before the seed heads actually form. And so what that does is that interim crop will grab nitrogen from the air, if it's something that's nitrogen fixing, and put it into the plant matter, right? And then when we kill that off, it returns that nitrogen actually into the soil rather than having it in the air. At the same time, that plant matter also increases organic matter and nutrients in the soil, and it also provides the soil with protection from damaging elements. So again, soil should not be bare, right? And so having those plants there helps to prevent erosion. And really, when you kill off that cover crop, it becomes a living mulch, right? So it reduces the weed pressure by being the competition that keeps other weeds down. So it's definitely something that's used commonly in farming, but this was the first time we did it in a community garden, which I thought was really cool. And then other mulch options, leaves, of course, they are a free resource. They're everywhere right now, I'm sure. And they also rapidly decompose. So they're a really great thing to add in the fall. You can also add straw as a bedding. So usually garlic and strawberries, that's where I would use the straw. But certainly be careful not to add it too early. So because it actually keeps that soil layer warmer, if you've planted your garlic early and then you put straw down early, it makes the garlic think that, oh, it's springtime, it's warm again, so I'm going to start to put some shoots out. And then once that happens and there's actually a hard frost, those shoots will die, and then you have a lot less, garlic germination in the spring. So just a few things to consider. And then wood chips are also a good mulch option if you can't find the other two. Just be careful that there are, if you're using fresh wood chips, there are a few issues that they bring with things like they'll increase the acidity of the soil, and they'll bind up some nutrients. Chips and okay, so we'll go into more cleanup information. So things to start cleaning up. You've got your tools. Now is the perfect time. If you're not going to use them again, just give them a little spray of maybe like just alcohol, and then wipe them down so that springtime. Throw your gloves in the laundry and get them clean so that you're not putting on crusty gloves in the fall or in the spring. Again, plants that have had disease problems in the growing season, definitely pull those up. And what you'll want to do is either, if you have a large compost pile where you know that the middle of the compost pile is hot and will kill pathogens, you can add them in. But if you're not sure, best thing to do is really just put it into your the paper bags for the municipal composting program, because they operate something that for sure generates heat so that it kills off the pathogens. Same thing with seed heads. So weeds that have seed heads, the whole plant, and you want to kind of leave that debris for ecological purposes, you can cut off the seed head, or you can pull the plant. But no matter what, you don't want to be adding it to your compost pile if you know your compost pile isn't going to be hot enough to actually kill off some of those seeds. So again, put them in the paper bag for the municipality to pick up, or the other thing is, if some people might actually have some backyard chickens, or there might be an animal sanctuary close to you that might actually take some of this stuff. So animals eating it is also a good option sometimes. And we're talking about compost as well. Something that we can do is add some finished compost to your beds. So now is a good time because it'll kind of break down further over the winter, and it just really gives a boost of microbes to your soil and nutrients so that it's all good to go in the spring. Certainly that doesn't mean that you don't add compost in the spring as well. It just sort of helps to put those things in stages, right? And we actually do have a workshop in the past that was trench composting. So trench composting is actually burying your food scraps, either in a deep trench or in a deep hole, and then letting it do its thing underground. So it's actually the easiest way to compost, really. And winter is a good time to do that as well, because once the ground freezes, you're not really worried about like animals or rodents getting into that, but it also does do a bit of decomposing. And then in the spring, it'll just keep doing that and you'll have some beautiful soil. So something I wanted to remind you guys of is that composting can still happen in the winter. So it can still be active in the winter. So I would encourage you to keep adding to it and keep turning it. I would reduce the number of times you turn it just because of heat loss. But you know, whatever you are doing to your compost pile during the growing season, I would say keep that up throughout the winter as much as you can, because you can still have a lot of decomposition happening over the winter. And what better to, you know, speed up that process to put out there. Obviously, the decomposition process will generate heat, and so that's what helps the compost to keep going. But you want a large enough pile because if your pile is not big enough, it's not going to, you know, generate much heat, and then the pile is going to stop breaking down. So definitely add as much as you can to it. You know, if you do have some leaves that you raked up, add them to the pile. Anything that you can find, make sure that there's just a bulk materials in there so that it keeps going. And then I've tried this before in terms of insulating your composter, and it can be done to help just to retain some of that heat that's generated. What I did was just had some leaf bags filled with leaves, and I just put them right around the composter and then sort of, you know, tied them together. It doesn't have to be very technical, but just something to help that composter keep its heat. So that could also be, you know, straw bales or loose straw. It could be some tarps, just whatever you have on hand, just to keep it going. And then we'll talk quickly about overwintering crops. So I did mention the garlic, and now is the best time to plant it. And we actually do have a workshop that we did last week, I think, or the last time, and it's on YouTube. So if you guys are curious about planting garlic and how to maintain it, feel free to check out our YouTube and look through that workshop. But now is the perfect time to be planting your garlic. And again, perennial bulbs, your tulips, your daffodils, that kind of thing. And then here's a picture of kale just thriving in the middle of winter. You know, it's covered in snow. It's obviously had frost, but it is perfectly happy and perfectly fine. So don't pull your kale if you have some in the garden, right? It actually tastes better after a frost. So, you know, it's just something to keep in mind. You don't have to pull every single thing that's growing in your garden right now. And then even things like lettuce, spinach, you can grow up to a certain point, and certainly with some help from things like cold frames or row cover. We'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. And then there are things that I've seen that have been seeded now. So things like rapini and your spinach, and it just gets large enough to establish itself. And then the frost will kill off sort of the top of it. And then in the spring it comes up and I've seen people have, you know, beautiful rapini, like full rapini plants ready on May 2-4 weekend, which was incredible. So just something to consider. You can actually prepare your planting right now for spring. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of season extension. Prolong your slightly colder months, and then so in the spring start your season slightly earlier. So some examples of season extension methods would be if you have larger space, a hoop house, so essentially an unheated greenhouse is obviously a good option, but pretty expensive, and you might not have the space for that. But we have smaller versions of this, like cold frames. So if you have, a raised bed, what you can do is you can maybe add some windows on top, or some plastic on top, and that actually really helps to retain some heat, and just allows things like lettuce to kind of keep growing until it really, really gets too cold. And then row cover is essentially this material here that you can see. So it's a breathable mesh that does help to retain some heat. And so it can either be just placed directly on top of things like your salad greens, or if you have something to prop it up, sometimes we get wire hoops that help to keep the row cover on top, and then your plants can grow underneath. So those are just some ideas for extending your season. And then lastly, I think reflections on your season. This is the best time to do it because everything's still fresh in your mind. You will forget once you're in, December, it's holidays or whatever, and you're not thinking about the garden anymore. And in the springtime, you're going to be like, what worked well? What didn't work well? I have no idea. Let's just start from scratch. So now is the perfect time to do it. So, get out a notebook or some paper on your phone and just jot down a few things that you learned from the season. Just for your consideration, what are some things that worked? What were some varieties that you really loved that you want to order seeds of again? What were some planting locations that worked really well? Maybe you realized you planted something under some shade and it needed to be in a better location. So just, maybe make a map or jot it down. And then timing as well, think ahead to spring. What would you like to change in terms of how you timed your plantings and that kind of thing? And then what didn't work, obviously, if you didn't like some variety, don't order it again. Definitely take note of where you had some disease or pest pressure. And one thing you can do is plan to rotate where you plant things. So if you had tomatoes that had late blight and you're worried about that coming back the next year, switch your planting of tomatoes to a different location the next year so that soil and that area has a little bit of time to, bounce back from some of those diseases. So again, this is the best time to be doing all of this instead of waiting until it starts to get really cold and, you don't really want to be thinking about the garden anymore. You're moving on to other things. So yeah, so that's the presentation, but I'm very curious to see if anyone has any suggestions, whether you've tried anything that works really well for you, and if anyone, has anything to share or any comments.
Yes, you did have a couple of questions. I do want to say thank you so much for all of that information. It was great to hear, and I'm a new gardener, as you know, so I'm going to be closing my garden very shortly, and I'm going to use a lot of this. I'm going to play this back and remind myself what you said. We did have Sally ask, can I plant garlic in a raised garden or for over the winter?
That's a great question. I mean, it depends on the size and the depth of your raised bed. So the thing that I would be worried about is obviously some like frost damage. So if you've got like tiny little pots, I would recommend either putting that in your garage so that it doesn't actually get exposed to extreme cold, or you could try and insulate it a little bit, put some stuff around it. But if you have a large raised bed, that would be okay. Just know if there's anything close to sort of the edge, they might get a little bit of frost damage because the soil actually has those insulating properties, right? So that's why putting it into the ground is always a safe bet. So you can do it, just be careful, you know?
Awesome. And Sally, if you have a follow-up question, please just type it in, or you can raise your hand and we can let you ask, turn on your microphone. It's up to you. We also have Young, who asked, where was it? That their rapini has blossomed. Should I trim the flower part and remain the roots, or keep the roots, I think, in the ground?
Oh, that's also a good question. You know what? I don't personally have experience overwintering rapini. I just had some amazing gardeners show me how they did it. So I don't want to give you information that I, am not sure about. I just know that they had said, the rapini that they put in the fall grew to be maybe about like I think half a foot tall or something, or several inches before it got covered over. And I just know that they had beautiful rapini in the spring. So yeah, I'm not too sure. I think my answer would always be like, just try it. Why not, right? Instead of pulling it, just try and trim your blossom and then keep it in there, and then that way we learn for next year. So Jung, you're gonna have to actually let us know in the spring what the result is.
Awesome. I actually had a question. You had mentioned about um, swapping crops. Like if there was a diseased tomato plant and you want to plant it into a different bed or into a different area, in the soil that was where the diseased plant grew, are we still able to plant other crops in there?
Yeah, absolutely. Another good question. So diseases will affect different families of plants differently. So say we had late blight on tomatoes, anything within the nightshade family, which is what tomatoes belong to, I would try and rotate and not plant in that same bed. But, things like maybe leafy greens or, garlic, it might not actually be affected by the late blight. So you can definitely still plant in that bed. Just know which families belong to which. And then also, if you have a small space, it's okay. Like there are so many other ways to try and prevent disease and like different practices. And also the fact that you're growing outside, the nature tries its best to sort of balance things out, right? So try and think of other ways to prevent, again, if we're talking about late blight, to prevent that late blight from coming back, even if you have to plant your tomatoes in the same place. There are other things to do. It's just these are sort of best practices that can help. One out of many things that can help.
Awesome. Thank you. Sally's asking, is it better to add manure in the fall or the springtime?
So I usually add compost. Well, I usually add compost in the spring. If you're adding manure, make sure that it is broken down. So fresh manure, you usually let it sit for a season or so before, like so that it's aged manure. But yeah, adding those amendments, I usually do that in the spring, but also if you have enough, I would put some down in the fall, just so that there's different stages of compost in your beds, right? So the stuff that you put down in the fall, it really does help to boost that microbial life and the nutrients in the soil, and it gets broken down over the winter, so that you've got a layer of really well broken down compost when you're starting up in the spring. And then when you add fresh compost there, you've got compost at a slightly different stage, right? And so it helps to continually feed your garden bed throughout the season. So yeah, it's a good idea to do some in the fall.
Okay, and the follow-up to that is like sheep, cow, horse, which is best?
Oh, that's such a good question. You know what? Don't, I don't know, like that's a very technical thing, right? So I don't know the technical details of that. Um, I know that like it also depends on sort of your ratio of nutrients coming from the different types of manure. So that's something that I probably have to, you know, do some research on and get back to you about. But no matter what, I think just making sure that it's aged and also mixing it in with some regular compost so that you're not just adding manure.
And another follow-up there is there something specific that can be added to soil to help with tomatoes?
Yeah, I think you know, with anything, not just tomatoes, um, when you're adding organic matter, it will benefit the plants, it will benefit the soil, it'll benefit the ecosystem. So organic matter is the key here. Whether that comes in the form of compost, manure, you know, leaf mulch, just as long as you are making sure that the soil is healthy. Now, if you're talking about things like nutrient deficiencies in tomatoes, that becomes more technical. And so certain things like blossom end rot, where the end of your fruit it turns sort of black and brown and starts to die off. That can indicate a deficiency in calcium. It can indicate that the plant doesn't have what it needs in order to absorb the calcium. And so for that, it would be maybe adding some like lime or limestone. It might be adding some crushed eggshells. So it really depends on what exact issue you have with the tomatoes.
Awesome. Thank you. And Sally says thanks. And Jen just wanted you to know she's also going to keep the eggplants in as well as an experiment.
Okay, okay. Let us know.
Um, I don't know if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. Oh, there was one more question that I had. And you had mentioned to put the row cover over certain types of plants or even the raised bed. And does that need to be like really secured? Is there a certain way to do that? Is there a type of row cover or landscape fabric or something that we should be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I've always used like the agricultural row cover. So I got that from, ooh, slipping my mind right now, but there's a supplier just across the provincial border. I think they come from Quebec, but they're really good. They have a lot of ag supplies. But you know, if you like, they usually come in large rolls, right? So um, if you want to like combine with some other people and order a bunch, and then that way you can split it up so that it's not this like you know, you don't need hundreds of feet of row cover for your backyard garden, right? Yeah, that could be useful. And you were saying, does it have to be very secure? So not really. I've had just like a sheet of row cover on top of a raised bed, and secured it a little bit with, we have these sort of, we call them staples. So they're just little wires that go like that, and you just stick them in and they keep the row cover at least down so that it doesn't blow over. But it's not like, you know, air can't get in or, you know, the sides are completely buried. And they've worked quite well that way. If you want to be um, very secure, then like if you want to be on the safe side, you can secure it down. But it is really labor intensive, right? So when we do our row cover, we take some soil and just bury the ends. But if you do the whole thing, it'll take you a long time. So it's how, yeah, it'll work either way.
Thank you. Thank you. Jung also asked, will we hold a workshop about bokashi?
So Marissa, you and I, we can look into that, and we'll let you know, Jung, if we find a good facilitator for that.
Yeah, we have talked about it and there has been some interest, so it's on our radar. So I'll just end off here. Oh, what is that? Sally is asking. Bokashi. I'll let you do a little explanation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not an expert, and we're just sort of like just learning about it. But from what I understand, I think it's a method of composting, like quick composting. Like it's supposed to be really, really fast, and it's also supposed to take all sorts of things that might not necessarily you might not think about composting. I think like, you know, chicken bones or and like some of that kind of thing. But again, we have to find a facilitator who's an expert on that so that they can actually teach us about it and teach everyone else about it.
Yeah, it's very exciting, and I'd be excited to learn about it. Jess, thank you so much for sharing all of that wisdom with us.